Well, then, earlier this week, I say earlier this week, it only went up today. You said that an episode that ends in 33 is usually cursed. Well, guess what? This week just happened to be cursed for the MMA Outsiders. We're not even hours. We're not even 12 hours that our episode is up. And already there have been developments and changes. I mean, it's only 2 headlines, but of course it has to be one that I wish we could have got into this episode, but it will be old news by the time we do our next one. And the other was about a point we made on our episode that is now completely irrelevant because of news that broke after the episode had finished airing.
Well, I mean, I guess the only thing you can say is MMA is the gift that keeps on giving, or in this case, combat sports is the gift that keeps on stunning everyone. And because I think as these developments were happening, you and I were just both as surprised, and that's when I brought up the idea. I was like, "Oh, Tom, we need to talk about this because this is huge, especially with our first story that we're going to get into in a second." But yeah, definitely a wild day in the MMA spirit. April 12th is a special meeting, considering that UFC 112 did take place on this very week about 13 or so years ago, and that had its own cursed elements to it. Before we get into more curses and more MMA talk, though, make sure to like and subscribe. Make sure to follow Empty the Bench Network everywhere across all social media platforms, and at MMA Outsiders ETP across all social media as well. I'm Zain Bando. You can find my work over at bjpen.com, and you can follow me across all social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter, what have you, at ZainBando99. And to my left is Tom Albano. And of course, you can find his work over at Fansided MMA. You can follow him on Twitter, respectively, at Thomas J. Albano and at Tom Talk Sports 9. Tom, we have a whole lot to get to this evening, so let's jump right into it. Thank you for the comment. Hello, Aubrey. Thank you for joining the live stream. We appreciate you, Tom. What the heck happened today?
Okay, so let's start with the news that we didn't talk about because it didn't go into our episode because it didn't break at that time. It didn't break until about 1 p.m. Eastern time this afternoon. Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul. So there was a rumored fight ever since Nate Diaz announced his retirement from the UFC after his last UFC win in September. It is now official. The boxing match will take place on August 5th in Dallas. It will be an 8-round bout. I believe it will be contested at 185 pounds.
Correct.
It will be 8-round bout. The guys will wear 10-ounce gloves, not 8-ounce gloves or 12-ounce gloves. It'll be 10. And the fight will be broadcasted from the American Airlines Center in Dallas on DAZN pay-per-view, to be specific.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the fight that Nate Diaz has been clamoring for, he's going to get his wish. He's going to get his big payday. I'm already potentially clearing my schedule to see if I can somehow make it out there because I want to see that spectacle for myself. And I actually can't believe it's even happening. But you have to remember, Tom, this is the same weekend a year ago where Jake Paul was supposed to have his long-awaited fight at Madison Square Garden against Tommy Fury. And the week of the fight, that never happened. I'm not saying never say never, but just know this weekend in the world of Jake Paul, this weekend of August 5th, August 6th, is not treating him very kindly. I understand everyone's very excited about this news, but this feels like one of those fights where you won't believe it until they step on the scale on that Friday. What do you think?
I mean, can I be honest with you? I thought he was gonna go after the Fury rematch first. Where is Jake Paul? Is the question. He's gonna be in Dallas on August 5th. Well, so we think. My idea, Zando, was that basically my thought process was that I thought he was going to go after the Fury rematch. I thought he was going to try and get his win back. But as you kind of alluded to, so in September, UFC 279, Nate Diaz finishes Tony Ferguson. He gets on the mic. He basically says, there's could be 1,000 things that are next for me. And he teased oh, maybe I need to go into boxing and show my, fellow MMA fighters how it's done. Basically, making reference to the fact that Anderson Silva, Tyron Woodley, Ben Askren all kind of, fell to fell to Jake Paul. Now, granted, they were not boxers. They were not striking specialists. All three. I mean, Anderson Silva was, but way, way past his prime. 10 or so years past his prime. Jake Paul, Tyron Woodley, more grappling based individuals. Nate Diaz, though, like we said, he just won a fight in September, and here he is. He's fresh out of the UFC contract, so he's going to be ready to go for August 5th. And as you kind of alluded to, this is a fight that Diaz has been clamoring for. He's been a proven draw. Jake Paul is a proven draw at some capacities. Obviously, a couple of his more recent pay-per-views haven't drawn as much, but you consider Jake Paul's star power and his crossoverness combined, Zan, with Nate Diaz's star power from the UFC, because he got to the point, Zan, where even Dana White had to admit that Nate Diaz moves the needle, and you're having these two forces clash. I mean, this is going to be a fight that draws this, and that's why I guess Paul goes for this over the Fury match, because he saw the opportunity for this fight and he jumped on it, and can't blame him.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you want to talk about draws and star power. That leads me to my next question. Obviously, Jake Paul's pay-per-view buy rates have been somewhat of a concern throughout his early career. Do you think this is the fight that has a chance to do really, really well and potentially break that 800,000, 900,000 threshold if promoted correctly?
But the key word right there, Zan, is that you said if promoted correctly. And the concern I have is not about Jake Paul or about Nate Diaz, but about the platform that they're going to be on, Zan. Because let's face it, the zone over the last couple of years has had a really rough go. I would say ever since the pandemic, it's been a rough go for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just a rough go, but having their subscription prices go up and then taking away the model that where it used to be, where once you bought the zone, you got everything. They added the pay-per-view model to it, and ever since then, it's felt kind of like an overblown rival to ESPN Plus, where it doesn't feel as unique as it once did. So I can totally understand where you're coming from that perspective. In terms of the fight itself, I think this is really the first time that Jake Paul is fighting a legitimate fighter that, and I'm not saying Tommy Fury isn't legitimate. Tommy Fury is the only real boxer that Jake Paul has faced.
But
But to
Tommy
me,
Fury is also a little more inexperienced, whereas Nate Diaz 30, 40, 50 fights in the
no,
or 30 fights
no,
today, yeah.
no, absolutely. My point in saying that though is this isn't a fight that Nate Diaz is going to walk in there, run around to get a paycheck. He's gonna go in there trying to viciously hurt Jake Paul. He's gonna try to put him in positions that Jake Paul has never been in. He's gonna try to make it a dirty boxing clinic and make it a fighter fight. And it seems like who Aubrey he wants. It's obvious that she's on Team Paul. But nonetheless, this is a fight where if Nate Diaz makes it his fight, he has a legitimate chance to dethrone the hype train once and for all, air quotes, because you don't exactly know like if the end of the Jake Paul saga is going to be near after
Mm.
this one. But I really do think that Nate Diaz has a chance that I don't think a lot of people are realizing, because his boxing is one of the most underrated in all of combat sports, and I think he'll display that on August 5th.
And that's the thing, Zan, that you mentioned about the walking around the ring. I mean, moving around the ring and such. I mean, I think Zan Anderson Silva always has some great striking, but the kind of what you just referenced was what Anderson Silva did against Jake Paul, where we didn't really see much, and we're like, I mean, he was in it for the payday and such. I know Diaz will definitely be in it for the payday, but I don't know if he's just going to be happy taking the payday. I think, Zan, knowing the personality of Nate Diaz like we know him, he's going to go in there to look to be the first person to knock Jake Paul out. Now, I'm going to flip that a little bit, because let's say Nate Diaz goes in and he does Anderson Silva it and basically doesn't try just because he gets the payday, or Jake Paul, either way, comes out on top. Then all of a sudden, that's the biggest win for Jake Paul's career, and all of a sudden, that loss against Tommy Fury now kind of gets, I don't want to say erased or eradicated, but like he gets to, it's the biggest rebound he could have had for that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, let's face it though. What I like about this fight is not really the two fighters who are fighting in the ring. They're both good at what they do, but I think what makes this fight so unique, and I'm sure you can probably attest to this, is that you're going to get fans from every spectrum. You're going to get MMA fans. You're going to get boxing purists. You're going to get I hate to use this word, but it's true. You're going to get casual fans on both sides. You're going to
Mhm.
get you're going to get the people who know Nate Diaz and Jake Paul from social media. You're going to have all of these worlds collide that I don't think people are fully taking into account. This really does feel like a true crossover boxing match of sorts that we probably haven't seen in several years in this new celebrity boxing era, and maybe even ever.
Again, Zan, I just think my only concern is how does the zone go about promoting this fight? Because, yeah, as we mentioned, it went from the WWE network model of you pay per month and you get everything to the ESPN Plus model where you've got the additional pay-per-view paywall. So obviously they're gonna want a high price for this fight, but you have to have the balance of making it, easy to access for everybody.
Very very well said. And I think that's just going to be something that we're going to have to continue to monitor, just because the news is so fresh. Um, but nonetheless, though, Tom, do you have an early prediction for this fight as to how it might go? What do you think?
Nate Diaz knockout 7th round.
Wow. Wow, very, very interesting and very bold on the day that this news breaks. Well, I'm going to hold you to that. I'm going to say Nate Diaz by decision, but I am going to agree with you in saying that Nate Diaz goes in his first real boxing test and gets it done.
And I think, well, let me ask you, Zen. Do you think he takes care of business early and then just, takes it easy over the last couple of rounds? Or do you think, as I think, he's going to go in guns blazing looking for the knockout early?
He's going to look for the knockout early, but I think it's going to be a closer fight than people think. Jake Paul is not going to lay down for Nate Diaz whatsoever, and I actually think it could be even through 6 rounds. It really could see a scenario where it could easily be 3-3 halfway through, and those last 2 rounds really dictate how the fight concludes. And I do think it's going to come down to who can win in the clutch, and I think Nate Diaz is just going to be a little bit sharper, a little crisper, have a better gas tank, and come out on top with a win in what will be a very competitive fight. It will not be a boring fight by any means. So if any of you out there think this fight is going to be boring, I think you are sadly mistaken, because it'll be anything but boring. That's
I
for
agree.
that's for sure.
I agree. It'll be competitive. Well, you mentioned decision, and I think back, Zan, to the Jake Paul Tommy Fury fight where we had that one scorecard in Paul's favor, and that's why I get a little concerned about if that fight goes to a decision if Diaz can win. That's why I'm saying for Diaz to win this fight, his best chance is one of those late rounds. He gets it done and gets Paul out of there.
Interesting. So speaking of the UFC crossover, does this effectively mean that more than likely we won't see a UFC pay-per-view the week of August 5th, considering that this is the fight that more than likely everyone's going to be talking about, or am I wrong in making that assumption this early? What do you think?
It depends on how petty Dana White is. Although, Zan, don't forget something. We've already got UFC International Fight Week July 8th. And remember the news that we did talk about on both our episode and the live stream that we had on Sunday. The UFC is looking potentially making a July 29th pay per view in London. Are they really going to do back to back weeks of pay per views? I don't see that at this point.
I don't see that. So it'll either be my prediction is this: it'll either be a rare off weekend or early afternoon start UFC fight night at the Apex or some other obscure location that is not known.
Correct, unless Dana decides to be really petty. But if he decides to be really petty, I think the only thing he would do is move the London pay-per-view back a week to August 5th rather than create two pay-per-views 2 consecutive weeks.
Could you imagine the UFC going head to head with this fight? It would be the talk of the combat sports universe, my friend. Absolutely. Back in the days of Anderson Silva versus James Urban and Affliction taking place on the same night. What do you watch?
That's gonna be, and unfortunately with the pay-per-view models of both, that would be an interesting question is people would have to make the choice. And I'll be honest, and if he does move the UFC 291 back a week to go head to head with this, I think Leon versus Colby, unless Colby is the heel of all heels, and I don't even know if even if he's the heel of all heels, it would work. I think Diaz versus Paul might win in the pay-per-view battle, unless DAZN screws something up with the promotion or price.
Which is more than likely going to be the case. Assuming we're assuming DAZN's past history of blunders, it would not it would not surprise me if this was just another blimp in the road.
Which
Um,
is but that actually brings up another question, Zan. I can't believe that DAZN even won the rights to this fight. They must be acting with, like we said, some sort of desperation. Because with Jake Paul and what he did with ESPN Plus with the Tommy Fury fight, I would have, and Nate Diaz being a UFC guy, I would have thought ESPN Plus would jump in on this.
Agreed, and obviously we don't know the stakes of the contract or the terms, but logically you could not tell me that ESPN wasn't in that rights conversation because they had to have been given Jake Paul and Nate Diaz's past history with the network. So just another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. So this is obviously stuff that's still developing. We'll talk more about this as it goes along. But that's the good news of today's little breaking news stream. Zan, speaking of UFC July, let's talk about the bad news. So this is actually one of those good news disguised as bad news. I mean, bad news disguised as good news kind of thing. So a report came out from Mark Raimondi and others earlier today that Brandon Moreno will defend the UFC Flyweight Championship in July at UFC 290 during International Fight Week against the number one contender Alexandra Pantoja. Now, you hear that and you say, okay, well, there's that, and Volk Yair already got confirmed for that, so maybe you put a third fight on there. Three title fights, and that would be the kind of card we would hope for. You put Jones Stipe on there. Well, we made reference to Jones Stipe early in the episode. So in this morning's episode, in episode 33, we talked about Dana White at the press conference, post-fight press conference of 287, saying that Jon Jones, basically after he won his fight against Cyril Gane, kind of disappeared from the negotiation table, but saying Jones versus Stipe will be made. The report, however, from Mark Raimondi today is that it still will be made, but it will not take place this summer at UFC 290. Volk Yair featherweight title unification now likely the main event.
Yeah, this feels like a repeat of UFC 213 all over again, does it not?
Zan, this feels honestly more like just a few months ago with 282. That we had the light heavyweight title fight. We're like, okay, there's got to be more. That they're pushing for Jones Stipe, or I mean, that's Jones and Ngannou, and it's just a letdown.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say
Well,
what I said on the show. This is perhaps one of the biggest letdowns ever. And I think this is just trying to further the point you were making, Santa. It seems like International Fight Week does not mean as much anymore.
oh no, it really doesn't. And I'm going to relay my same point again. UFC 264 wasn't even a formal international fight week. It ended up being UFC 266. And look, we have mine the card. It was Alexander Volkanovski. And look, he's back in a similar situation again, headlining his second IFW. Don't get me wrong. We love Alexander Volkanovski on the show. We have high praise for him. But
I've talked
That's
about how excited I am for this fight.
that's a
But
lot of that's a lot of damn pressure. Given that it's UFC 290, July 8th, usually a high stakes card, and that's the main event. It's a little disappointing.
that's going to be the question I asked, Dan. So obviously, we talked about Alexander Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez, and we've talked about how great of a fight it's going to be, maybe fight of the year candidate. Does this now mean, Zan, that like now it must be a fight of the year candidate? If it's a one-sided fight, like it's going to be one of the most disappointing main events of this year.
You could say that, but here's something that I haven't seen anyone discuss.
Hmm.
Um, Tom, could you foresee a scenario where you get the return of Jamal Hill on this card? Do you think that's a potential possibility?
I mean, it is Zan. We actually, because we talked since we brought up August with Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul, we did mention on the live stream and maybe on this week's episode. I forget. This is my sixth show in the week, guys. Everything is blurring together on this network.
I can
Um,
I can I can remind you depending on what you say.
about the potential of if an August pay per view happens for the UFC, a light heavyweight title fight could headline it.
Yeah, we did talk about this. Yep.
So you're right, Zan, in that if they don't do an August pay per view, or they decide if they don't do an August pay per view for their pay per view scheduling because they want to push UFC 300 up to July next year, or the scheduling with the Nate Diaz thing, maybe it's a possibility that there are three title fights in UFC 290 and they do Jamal Hill versus, I don't know, Magomed Ankalaev or Yuri Prohaska if Yuri's able to come back from his injury, unless I would say, Pereira because of what was made mention of this past weekend, but I don't know if I want Pereira back in there just 3 months after getting knocked out.
No, I don't think 3 months after getting knocked out is A, a smart idea, and B, to thrust him into a title fight in a different weight class after losing his middleweight title probably isn't smart
Yeah,
either.
as I said on that discussions, and I think him versus Jan Blachowicz, the former champ, would be a good first fight at light heavyweight for Pereira.
True. And hey, it'd be another good fight is Jamal Hill versus Jan Blachowicz if they wanted to go that route. Oh, too, that could be a possibility. Although I know they really wanted Yuri back in there whenever he was ready to compete. So
And I think that depends on Yuri's availability. If Yuri is ready to go for July, then yeah, I could see Yuri being added in. I mean, Zan, obviously what they do is they put the heaviest weight class as the main event. But Zan, I mean, if they still wanted to do Volk and Yair and have that headline and put the Hill and Yuri as the co-main event, I still think that's a solid three title fight card, even without
ab-
Miocic.
absolutely. And just to clarify, the Volk versus Rodriguez has not been confirmed as the official main event yet, right?
It's expected to be at this
Okay.
point. Like
Okay.
you said, unless there is a third title fight in the works, and I haven't heard, you haven't heard, I don't think anyone has heard. As of right
Right.
now, the expectation is Volk Yair main events.
Oh, trust me, if I had heard and if I could be the first to break it, I definitely would have. But I don't have that power yet, unfortunately.
Neither
But
do
I
I. Oh,
will. I will go ahead. Go ahead. Go
no,
ahead.
you first, because I want to go on a different point.
No, I was just going to say, I will say though, for the lighter weight divisions, on a more positive note, it's kind of cool to see both of them shine and to see two of the most exciting fighters in the world, Volk and Moreno, get the spotlight that they deserve in Vegas. Because I think I've told you, when you go to Brandon Moreno autograph signings in Vegas, people love him. Now he has a chance to fight on the biggest stage, on the biggest card of the year. Good for him. Am I right in saying that?
Very true, but like, I mean, it's both. It's like, yes, I'm glad Volk versus Yair gets the stage, but at the same time, this is the kind of stage that you want something like a Jones Miocic to headline, especially with you know, they want the International Fight Week to be as big, bigger than it was pre-pandemic, get everybody back from the pandemic. The Hall of Fame class, that's incredible this year. So Volk versus Zaire needs to live up to what it can be and needs to be a fight of the year candidate for all this to go well. That being said, let's talk about the Jones and Miocic thing here. So this news combined with Dana's comment at the post-fight press conference leads me to suspect that there's something going on between Jones and the UFC. My first instinct also, Zan, is to say, if all this is true, I don't think Jon Jones has a right to say anything about Francis Ngannou anymore.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Because if this fight doesn't happen, Zan, if this fight somehow does not happen, whether it be in July or later in this year, you're gonna tell me that it's not disgraceful that Jon Jones gets to be the double champ and arguably the GOAT of the sport without taking on either Ngannou or Stipe?
Right, and it's like, what was the point of having Jones come back to heavyweight in the first place if this is what he was going to do all along? Because that's what it's starting to seem like too. Is it not?
Yeah, it's like it feels like, Zan, there's still a possibility that I think it was your friend Dylan from Combat Press who said this, that there's a chance that Jon Jones could just retire after that one fight where he wins the heavyweight title, and that's a disaster scenario for the UFC. Losing Jones with just one fight and losing Ngannou and basically, letting him walk to free agency.
Yeah, okay, so let's play a scenario. Let's assume in this scenario that Jon Jones is out of the picture and that Stipe is still with the company. What do you do with the heavyweight title?
That's a great question, Zan. I'm gonna go to the heavyweight rankings because I know we crap on the UFC rankings, but I mean, you look at it. Stipe's
by the way, the rankings are updated at the time of this recording for this week. Just so you know.
Okay. And here's the funny thing, Zan. According to the UFC rankings, going by what we go by, Stipe's only number 2 on that list. Cyril Gane is still listed as the number 1 contender. So, do you do Stipe versus Cyril and take the criticism of giving Cyril another title shot, especially one off of a loss? Or do you go, Zan, with either... I mean, number 3 is Sergey Pavlovich. I mean, maybe.
But Pavlovich has to fight Blades. So we got to see.
Right, and actually Blades is 4. So do you go Stipe versus the winner of Pavlovich versus Blades?
It makes sense because Blades has been clamoring for a title shot for 3.5 years. I think it makes sense.
Number 5, Tom Aspinall. Way too early for him to... I mean, I shouldn't say way too early, but still a little too early for him to get a title shot at this point, unless injuries happen and they get desperate. Although if injuries happen and they get desperate, I think they would look more, Zan, towards number 6, Tai Tuivasa. Because even though Tai Tuivasa is not in the top contender rank anymore, he's still an entertaining fighter. It's like, at this point, if they needed a last-minute desperation, they throw him a bone.
Tom, I understand you're excited about the top 6, but you're leaving out the biggest elephant in the room and the biggest outlier that we haven't talked about.
Oh, no.
What if the UFC decides to go behind the 8 ball and re-signs Brock Lesnar to a one-fight deal for the UFC?
Yes, because of the freaking Endeavor deal, yes! And we finally get Brock Lesnar versus Stipe Miocic or Brock Lesnar versus Jon Jones, like 5 or 6 years too late.
Hey, never say never when the new publicly traded company is worth $21 billion, right?
Correct. Zan, I mean, at least you asked about Brock. I thought you were going to say, imagine if they have Conor McGregor move up to heavyweight. Or I thought you were going to ask me where Kevin Lee fits into all of this.
Well, yeah, I had to mention Brock just to get a kick out of you a little bit, and it would definitely get the UFC talking amongst all the big news sources that don't know how to cover MMA. So there you go.
That is true.
Nonetheless, though, in reality, though, I do like your matchmaking with the top 6. I do think worst case scenario, if Jones is out of the picture, you do Stipe versus the winner of Sergey and Curtis Blades. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Now
And
they
if
are
if Jones fights Stipe, I think whoever wins the fight, assuming the fight happens, that should still be the same scenario too.
now the less panicky, the world is ending, the sky is falling scenario is that this fight does happen in the fall. Zen, if this fight happens in the fall, I have a little bit of a crazy idea. It's going to be a longer wait, but I have a crazy idea. So the assumption we have right now is that Chandler Connor fight is going to happen in September, correct?
I would say so, considering that the season is 10 weeks, and that would be right around the time frame a month.
August 15th, the season would end. They'd have the tough finale, and then a few
Right.
more weeks for the coaches fight.
Exactly. Yep.
October, Abu Dhabi, obviously, we talked about on the show. It would have to be Islam Makhachev versus either Oliveira or Benil Dar. Is it Benil Dariush she's fighting in May?
Yeah.
Or
Oliver
Benil
versus
Dariush
Dariush.
trains
Yeah.
Poirier or something like that in October. Zen, Jon Jones is, he always fights out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's where his camp is. But do you
Okay.
know where he was originally born?
Ithaca, New York.
And has Stipe Miocic ever competed in New York?
No.
You get where I'm going with this, aren't you?
Yeah. So you want the November
Jon
MMA?
Jones versus Stipe Miocic headlining UFC 290 whatever in November for the heavyweight title at Madison Square Garden.
And if that were to occur, would you do everything in your power to physically be there if you are able to? I feel I feel like that's one from where you're from that you would try your best not to miss if
Yes.
you could if you could physically be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Zan, like again, longer wait, bigger chance that something could happen. But if that were to be the case, September with Connor and Chandler, October with Abu Dhabi, November Jones Stipe. That would be setting up for perhaps the biggest last 3 to 4 months of the year for the UFC, if possible.
True. And then for December, what do you do in your opinion? Assuming we're going with this scenario, what would you do in December?
See if the Leon Colby winner from July is ready to make a title defense.
To fight Gilbert Burns, right?
Probably.
Okay. Yeah, I like where you're going.
Or
Yeah.
see if Adesanya is ready to make a title defense.
That would be or let's have both of them compete on the same card in December.
Zen, actually, yeah, that could be physically possible. Because I was gonna say, maybe you had a lower weight class, but I mean, you could physically do 2 title fights in November at the Garden and 3 in Vegas in December, or vice versa. You could do both. You could do that to end the year with a bang for pay-per-views.
True. And then about Dustin Poirier, do you think he fights the winner of Oliveira versus Dariush next, or do you think he jumps to fight for a championship? In your opinion?
I think that depends on how the fight next month plays out. If the fight next month plays out with Oliveira submitting Dariush, Oliveira's getting the rematch. If Dariush beats Oliveira, well, here's my thing: if Dariush beats Oliveira, Dariush has to probably get the next title shot right away because Oliveira is the number 1 contender. If Oliveira wins, I say it depends on if Dana is impressed, because then it becomes the question of, do you want to run that fight back, or do you think that Oliveira wasn't that impressive that you give, Poirier the fight? Because Poirier, of course, came very close in that when he fought Khabib a few years ago in submitting Khabib. Do you have him take on Khabib's protege?
Those are all very good scenarios. I would say the most likely one is if Charles Oliveira wins, he fights Dustin Poirier again, as like a main card opener or second fight of the night on a massive pay-per-view.
But then who would get the lightweight title shot?
Yeah, that's a good question. Would you go? Would you go with an outlier, perhaps a guy that no one's really talking about that you think deserves it? opinion, that isn't the biggest name in the sport.
Unless you're saying that you would give the title shot to Gaethje if
Yeah,
Oliveira wins.
yeah, exactly.
That'd be interesting.
hmm And it
All
would
right.
be and it would be a fresh matchup considering Makhachev and Gaethje have never fought each other. So,
Very true.
hmm
All right. So I think that just about does it. That covers both stories that we needed to get in, and we did it in about 30 something minutes.
Absolutely. Again, just to let you guys all know, our full episode is out. A lot to cover. We went a little bit more in depth on UFC 287. There's also a special guest fighter interview at the very end of the show if you want to check that out. And yeah, this was just a very busy week in the history of the MMA Outsiders, as I alluded to at the beginning of this. So thank you guys for sticking with us and bearing with us. As we always say, MMA has no off season, and that definitely proved it with today's news. Before we get out of here, though, make sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to follow the Empty the Bench podcast network across all social medias. Be sure to follow the MMA Outsiders at MMA Outsiders ETB. And of course, you can catch the podcast not only on YouTube, but it is available now across all audio only platforms. So if you don't like seeing either of our faces, you can listen. You can listen to the MMA Outsiders wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to turn on the notification bell across all social media platforms. That way, you don't miss anything related to the MMA Outsiders or the Empty the Bench podcast network. And thank you again for tuning in. Of course, if you guys are joining late, the two big stories that we just went over, Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz, official for August 5th in Dallas, Texas at the American Airlines Center, and it will be broadcast on DAZN pay-per-view at 185 pounds in an 8-round affair. And then, of course, UFC 290 is looking a little bit clearer. It will not be Jones versus Miocic. It will more than likely be two title fights, Alexander Volkanovski versus Yara Rodriguez, and Brandon Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas on July 8th. So there you go.
Yeah, and that just about does it. For Zain, Bando, on Albano. We'll see you next time on the MMA Outsiders. Hopefully, with no breaking streams on episode 34 next Wednesday, 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific.
We'll see you there. And of course, before we get out of here, as we always like to say, be Joe Pyfer.
Be Joe Pyfer. Have a good one, guys.
Have a good one.